My estranged sister invited me to her wedding, so I went. But when she saw me with a baby bump, she accused me of faking it to overshadow her and pushed me to the ground out of spite. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital and my sister was in handcuffs, begging me not to press charges. My estranged older sister, Maggie, recently invited me to attend her wedding. This is surprising since we've never really gotten along, so I wasn't expecting an invitation at all. However, now that she has invited me, I'm not really sure if I actually want to go, given our complicated history and how distant we've always been. You see, the issue between us started back when we were both still kids. I was always the sick child, the one who constantly dealt with health problems and required extensive medical care. I spent a significant part of my childhood in and out of hospitals, undergoing various treatments and surgeries that often kept me confined to hospital rooms rather than playing outside with friends. Because of my health issues, my parents naturally spent a great deal of time with me, often staying up with me through long, anxious nights in the hospital. At times, these surgeries would come one after another, leaving me and my parents practically living in the hospital. This was all incredibly difficult for Maggie. My parents' attention was largely centered on my health, meaning Maggie received much less of their time and affection. During my long hospital stays, Maggie would often have to stay with our grandparents, who were kind enough to take her in. But I imagine it must have been lonely for her. In Maggie's mind, all those missed moments, those long nights away from our parents, became something she felt I was responsible for. Apparently, I was the reason her childhood was filled with waiting, watching from the sidelines as our parents poured all their energy into caring for me. As a result, Maggie grew to resent me deeply and made her feelings known to me all my life. She harbored a lingering bitterness, believing that, because of me, she was deprived of the nurturing and closeness she wanted from our parents. However, the truth was that this was all in her head. You might think I am being cruel, even heartless, to write this, but in reality, my parents loved Maggie just as much as they loved me. There was no favoritism. The moment my health stabilized and I could finally return home, they wasted no time in reuniting our family. They brought Maggie back from our grandparents, and from that point on, they went to great lengths to make up for the months she had spent away, determined to remind her of her importance in their lives. They took her on memorable trips to Disney, where she could have fun with them. They organized grand, elaborate birthday parties for her every year, pulling out all the stops to celebrate her and make her feel special. They never missed an opportunity to cheer her on at her basketball games every weekend. Every chance they got, they spent quality time with my sister, going above and beyond to rebuild the closeness that might have seemed lost during my hospitalizations. And yet, Maggie never saw any of their efforts. She was too stubborn and couldn't let go of the feeling of abandonment during those few months she had spent away from us. To her, nothing our parents did was enough to erase the loneliness she had felt during that time. Her resentment continued to grow, and she would bring up this topic over and over again during our family discussions. Any time she would use it as her trump card to win every argument and make our parents feel guilty. This was a constant pattern with her, where she never allowed us to fully move forward. For years, I put up with Maggie's behavior, letting her use that old grudge against me to get her way whenever it suited her. I just stayed quiet whenever she would try to argue with me or start a fight. But after I grew up and left for college, something shifted in me. With distance came a fresh perspective, and I realized that Maggie was not really a nice sister to me. Everything was always about her, and she hardly ever asked me how I felt. After this realization, my patience with Maggie's constant complaints started to grow thin. During my college breaks, whenever I would go back home, anytime she tried to bring up that tired old topic about how she felt neglected as a child and how our parents supposedly loved me more, I would argue back with her and ask her to shut up and leave me alone. This would trigger her to yell at me even more. God, it was like she was a broken record who just wouldn't stop talking about it. I had no sympathy left to give anymore. Things reached a breaking point on my 21st birthday. My parents had planned a beautiful, extravagant celebration for me, inviting close family and friends to mark this milestone. It was an evening filled with laughter, joy, and all the people I cared about. Maggie was there, of course, but instead of joining in the festivities, she spent the evening getting increasingly drunk and venting to anyone who would listen. She went on and on about how I was the golden child, and how her parents had always favored me while we were growing up, and how she had never gotten the same love or attention. She even said that she wished she had a birthday party like this one, insinuating that my parents had somehow shortchanged her over the years. This was completely untrue. Just a few months earlier, Maggie had celebrated her own 21st birthday by going on a lavish trip to Mexico with her boyfriend, a trip our parents had fully funded since she had practically forced them to do so. That trip hadn't ended well for her, though. Shortly afterward, her boyfriend broke up with her, and she regretted taking him along. However, it was her decision to spend her big day in a tropical paradise rather than at home with family and friends. Clearly, the disappointment from her breakup lingered, and it was as though she had redirected all of her resentment toward me, as usual. For my part, I had always wanted to celebrate with family to mark my 21st birthday surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me. My parents, knowing how much this meant to me, had happily agreed to host a big gathering, sparing no effort to make it memorable. But rather than respecting my choice, Maggie seemed to resent it, as though my preference for family time was just another way I was being favored over her. It was as if she couldn't see past her own hurt, refusing to acknowledge the decisions she had made that contributed to her own unhappiness. After I cut the cake and began sharing pieces with everyone, I handed a slice to Maggie as well. But as soon as she took her piece, she made a snide comment, joking that she had been given the smallest piece of cake because she was obviously the least favored in the family. I felt a surge of irritation rise up. Here she was yet again, slipping that familiar complaint into what was supposed to be a joyful moment. I finally had enough. I rolled my eyes and, with thinly veiled frustration, asked her, "Can you just stop making these comments? No one is the least favorite, it's all in your head." My comment struck a nerve. Maggie bristled immediately, pushing back by saying she had only been joking and that I was overreacting to her harmless jest. But I told her bluntly that her jokes weren't funny to anyone. They were just repetitive at this point and completely unnecessary. She looked at me, insulted, but I simply walked away. I tried to focus on mingling with the other guests throughout the evening, hoping to salvage what was left of the celebration without further drama. Later, after the party wound down and most of the guests had left, Maggie cornered me with my parents, clearly upset. She accused me of trying to make her feel bad over what she called a harmless joke. She told me that I could have just ignored it like I usually did instead of taking things so personally. I was exhausted by the whole thing by that point, so I simply tried to ignore her, deciding it wasn't worth the energy. But my parents tried to talk to her, expressing how even they felt she brought up this matter far too often and that it hurt them to hear her continually accuse them of favoritism. They reminded her that they had always done their best to treat us equally and to ensure that both of us felt loved and valued. This set Maggie off, and once again, she launched into the familiar rant, insisting that the time I was sick had taken our parents away from her, leaving her feeling abandoned and alone. My parents tried to reason with her, reminding her of the reality of that time. They explained yet again that they had left her in the care of our grandparents, two loving people who had always gone out of their way to make her feel at home. They pointed out that they had visited her as often as possible, juggling their time between the hospital with me and ensuring she was looked after. But Maggie didn't want to hear it. She was stuck in her narrative, convinced that her experience was one of rejection and neglect. No amount of reassurance or reasoning seemed to shake her belief. In her mind, the situation was black and white, and the complexities of our family's struggles didn't matter. I just shook my head, weary of hearing the same arguments replayed yet again. Noticing my detached expression, Maggie snapped, asking if I even cared about her feelings and why I hadn't tried to apologize for embarrassing her earlier. Her accusation felt absurd. I looked at her, exasperated, and told her I had nothing to apologize for. She had embarrassed herself by acting like a fool and clinging to this endless need to play the victim. I added that everyone was used to her act by now, and frankly, it wasn't working anymore. My words struck a nerve. Maggie's face flushed, her eyes full of hurt and anger, as she shouted, "I wish you had died instead of going through those surgeries. Then maybe my parents wouldn't have had to spend so much time with you in the hospital and leave me behind." Her words hit like a punch to the gut, silencing everyone. My parents looked at her, horrified. My dad was the first to respond, his tone firm but controlled, as he told Maggie she had crossed a line. He warned her to stop before she said anything else she might regret. Maggie stood there, momentarily stunned by the weight of her own words, then left abruptly, looking embarrassed and shaken by the confrontation. Even after the dust settled, Maggie never apologized to me for what she had said that night. I started to slowly realize that she had actually meant those harsh words. As a result, in the years that followed, I found myself distancing from her, unable to forgive or forget. Our parents made multiple attempts to mend things, trying to repair the fractured bond between us, but nothing seemed to work. I kept my guard up, and Maggie never showed any real effort to bridge the gap either. We remained estranged ever since, and that was how things stood, until this year. I recently heard about Maggie's engagement through our parents. They seemed really happy for her and were hoping that I could reach out to congratulate her on the happy news, but I never did. After all, we hadn't been close in years, and I felt no inclination to step in. Then, unexpectedly, Maggie reached out to me. She told me she wanted to reconnect, and asked if I could meet her for lunch so that we could talk. Although I was surprised, I firmly declined and told her that I wasn't interested. Shortly after, she went to our parents, asking them to pressure me into meeting her. When my parents urged me to agree, I still said no. I just couldn't understand why she wanted to meet up with me all of a sudden and had no desire to walk into what felt like an emotional ambush. Not to be deterred, my parents eventually found a way to set up a meeting. They invited me to lunch without mentioning that Maggie would be there too. When I arrived and saw her sitting at the table, I was annoyed and felt cornered, but I stayed, mostly out of respect for my parents, who urged us to talk and work things out. Though I was frustrated, I realized there was no easy way out of the situation, so I finally decided to see what Maggie had to say. It was then that Maggie finally apologized to me after all those years. She spoke earnestly, admitting how much she had missed me over time. Though I was initially icy and skeptical, her apology felt genuine. She explained that she wanted to mend our relationship, saying she was finally happy with her partner and felt truly secure with him. She continued to tell me that she didn't want me absent on what she hoped would be the best day of her life. Maggie said it would mean so much to her if I attended her wedding, which was happening in a few months, and met her partner and his family. I was hesitant, so I told her I would need some time to think about it. I hadn't expected any of this. The apology, the invitation, the sudden desire to include me. It was all a lot to process, so I left her with that, unsure of what I really wanted to do and needing time to decide if I could put aside the past to be there for her. Since that lunch, my parents have been reaching out to me almost nonstop, urging me to attend Maggie's wedding and insisting that she has changed. They believe she deserves a second chance and that it's time to put the past behind us. They tell me that holding on to this resentment toward my sister is only hurting me and that accepting her apology would be a sign of maturity and forgiveness. They've even hinted that my refusal to move forward is causing unnecessary strain on the family, saying that I'm being stubborn, even cruel, for not accepting her apologies. But for me, it's not that simple. Years of tension and unresolved hurt don't just disappear because of one apology. I can't just erase the things Maggie has said and done, nor can I forget the years she treated me like a rival. It's not about being mean. It's about protecting myself from a pattern that's left me hurt before. While I can see why my parents want us to reunite, I can't ignore that their pressure feels more like guilt than encouragement. They seem to want this family harmony so badly that they're overlooking the reality of all we went through. I know forgiveness is important, but I'm not sure if I'm ready or if I can trust that this change in Maggie is truly permanent. After much deliberation, I finally agreed to attend Maggie's wedding. My parents were absolutely overjoyed by the news. This felt like a significant step for me and for the family dynamics that had been so strained. I decided to go with my boyfriend, William, which gave me a sense of comfort and support. While I still had mixed feelings about being there, I hoped that attending could help mend some fences between me and Maggie and perhaps provide a fresh start. It was also essential for my parents to see their daughters together, especially after everything we had been through. When the wedding day arrived, I did my best to keep an open mind. I even wore a loose-fitting dress to minimize attention on my pregnancy, hoping to avoid any unnecessary drama. However, as soon as Maggie saw me with a baby bump, her demeanor changed. She kept glaring at me throughout the ceremony, and I could feel the tension building. Afterward, some family members congratulated me warmly on the pregnancy, but the interactions were brief and respectful. Despite this, Maggie seemed furious, as though my mere presence was stealing her thunder. During the reception, Maggie approached me with a cold, skeptical look. She asked, "Are you really pregnant, or are you just faking it to get attention?" Her words stung, but I calmly responded, "Yes, I am pregnant, and I have ultrasound photos to prove it." I showed her the images on my phone, hoping to put her doubts to rest. But instead of backing down, Maggie accused me of timing my pregnancy to overshadow her wedding. She said, "This is so typical of you, always trying to be the center of attention." I was stunned by her accusations. I explained that my pregnancy was unplanned and had nothing to do with her wedding, but she wouldn't listen. She kept cutting me off, repeating how I always made everything about myself. Finally, I snapped and told her, "If you feel that way, maybe we shouldn't have reconnected in the first place. I'm done with this." I turned to walk away, but in that moment, Maggie shoved me from behind. I stumbled forward, instinctively clutching my belly to protect my baby, and fell hard to the ground. Pain shot through my wrist as I landed awkwardly, and I felt a dull ache radiating through my stomach. I was terrified for my baby and for myself. A cry of pain escaped my lips as I lay there, unable to move for a moment. William and several guests rushed over, horrified by what had just happened. My parents, who had been nearby, were among the first to reach me. Maggie, meanwhile, was still yelling, accusing me of ruining her wedding and calling me names in front of everyone. The scene was chaotic, guests whispering in shock, my parents trying to help me up, and William demanding that someone call an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, I was in tears, clutching my wrist and overwhelmed with fear for my baby. As I was being helped onto a stretcher, William, visibly furious, called the police. Several guests had witnessed Maggie pushing me and were more than willing to provide statements. It was clear to everyone that what she had done was not just cruel, but dangerous. Maggie's husband tried to intervene, begging William not to escalate the situation. But William wouldn't hear it, and frankly, neither would I. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about protecting my unborn child. Maggie had crossed a line, and she needed to face the consequences of her actions. When the police arrived, they took statements from multiple witnesses, and Maggie was arrested for assault on the spot. She screamed at me as they took her away, begging me not to press charges, but I stayed silent, my focus entirely on the well-being of my baby. At the hospital, the doctors ran a series of tests to ensure my baby was okay. Thankfully, the baby was unharmed, but I had sustained a fractured wrist and multiple bruises from the fall. I was kept overnight for observation, and William stayed by my side the entire time, holding my hand and assuring me that everything would be okay. My parents were devastated by what had happened. They apologized repeatedly, blaming themselves for pressuring me to attend the wedding in the first place. While I didn't hold them responsible, I couldn't help but feel frustrated that they had pushed so hard for a reconciliation when I had been so hesitant from the start. This wasn't the first time Maggie had hurt me, but it was the most severe, and it could have ended tragically. After being discharged from the hospital, I returned home to rest and recover. My fractured wrist was in a cast, and my body was covered in bruises. Emotionally, I felt drained, but the relief of knowing my baby was safe outweighed everything else. William was an incredible support during this time, helping me with everything from household tasks to managing my doctor's appointments. My parents also visited often, bringing meals and checking in to make sure I was comfortable. Maggie, however, continued to be a problem even after her arrest. She called me multiple times from jail, leaving voicemails begging me to drop the charges. Her tone ranged from pleading to angry, accusing me of blowing the situation out of proportion and ruining her life. She even went so far as to blame me for ruining her wedding, as if her actions were somehow my fault. I didn't respond to any of her calls. I had nothing to say to her. My parents, for their part, had finally reached their limit with Maggie. They told me they were ashamed of her behavior and no longer felt the need to try and mediate between us. My mom, who had always tried to see the best in Maggie, admitted that she now realized how toxic Maggie's jealousy and resentment had been over the years. They fully supported my decision to pursue legal action and even offered to testify on my behalf if necessary. A few weeks later, Maggie's case went to court. With multiple witnesses testifying about what had happened at the wedding, the evidence against her was overwhelming. She was convicted of assault and sentenced to 1 year in jail. The court also granted me a restraining order, ensuring that Maggie couldn't come near me or my family for the foreseeable future. The verdict brought a sense of closure, though it didn't erase the pain she had caused. In the weeks following the trial, Maggie's husband reached out to me. He wanted to talk about what had happened and understand the full context of our relationship. We met for coffee, and I explained everything: Maggie's years of resentment, her constant accusations, and how her jealousy had culminated in the incident at the wedding. He was shocked, admitting that Maggie had always painted herself as the victim and had never shared the full truth with him. Shortly after our conversation, I learned that he had filed for an annulment. It seemed that the incident at the wedding had been a wake-up call for him, and he no longer wanted to be tied to someone capable of such cruelty. While I didn't feel it was my place to celebrate the end of their marriage, I couldn't help but feel relieved that he was able to see the reality of who Maggie truly was. As the weeks turned into months, I focused on healing, both physically and emotionally. William and I prepared for the arrival of our baby, channeling all our energy into creating a peaceful and happy home. My parents continued to support us, visiting often and helping with anything we needed. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm and security, free from Maggie's toxicity. Then, the most joyful moment of my life arrived. Our baby was born. The labor was exhausting, and the sleepless nights that followed were a whirlwind, but holding my baby in my arms for the first time made everything worthwhile. William was over the moon, and my parents were absolutely smitten with their first grandchild. Watching them bond with the baby brought tears to my eyes. It was everything I had ever dreamed of for my family. Maggie, meanwhile, was still serving her sentence. I occasionally heard updates about her from distant family members, but I paid them no mind. I had no interest in rekindling any form of relationship with her. The restraining order ensured that she couldn't contact me directly, and I was determined to keep it that way. Interestingly, Maggie's ex-husband reached out one final time after their annulment was finalized. He wanted to thank me for being honest with him about Maggie's behavior. He said it had given him the clarity he needed to make the difficult decision to end their marriage. While it was clear he was still grappling with the emotional fallout, he seemed to be doing better and was focused on moving forward with his life. As for me, life gradually returned to normal, or rather, a new kind of normal. Parenthood was challenging, but it was also incredibly rewarding. William and I found joy in the small, everyday moments, feeding our baby, watching them sleep, and even navigating the chaos of diaper changes. My parents were a constant source of support, giving us the space to adjust while also lending a helping hand when needed. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I felt a mix of emotions. Maggie's actions at the wedding were unforgivable, but they had also forced me to finally confront the years of resentment and toxicity she had brought into my life. In a way, her behavior had been a wake-up call, showing me the importance of setting boundaries and prioritizing my own well-being. While I wish things could have been different between us, I no longer felt the need to carry the burden of her bitterness. Now, as I hold my baby and look toward the future, I feel a sense of hope and peace. My family may not be perfect, but I am surrounded by people who love and support me unconditionally. For the first time in a long time, I feel truly free. Free to focus on the life I'm building with William, free to cherish the joy of motherhood, and free to let go of the pain Maggie had caused for so many years.